Good. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for being here. It's really an honor that so many of you all turned out. It's great to see some familiar faces. Some of you know I was a former fellow here at the Harvard University Center for the Environment in the History of Science Department. And the talk you're at today is, the book's floating around somewhere. I didn't have a copy, but in any case, it's a book that I finished writing while I was here as a fellow. So it's really a huge honor to be able to come back and share the final result with all of you. The format for today is I'm going to be talking for about 20 to 25 minutes. I'm going to try and keep it to that. I gave this before. It clocked in at 30 minutes exactly. I've cut what I think is 5 to 10 minutes of it. We'll see how good I do. In any case, I'm going to try to give you a brief overview of the book. It's sort of intentionally brief. It's not going to do justice to the depth of everything that's in the book, but I want to make sure to give time for the panelists to talk a little bit and then to open it all up to you for Q&A. Before I jump into it, I do want to just start with a bunch of thank yous. So first and foremost, thank you to everyone at both Houston and the History of Science Department that supported me while I was here. This book very literally would not have happened without all of your support. That includes Gabriela and Victor, who are my mentors here. And Dustin, thank you so much for rounding out the panel as well. It's great to have you all here. I really appreciate it. I want to thank Jim and Laura for having me back, for organizing this talk. Huge help. And then again, thanks to all of you for coming. I know some of you had read parts of the book when it was, in its final stages. I spammed a bunch of colleagues with emails about the visuals to weigh in on it. So again, I see some faces that were on those chains. So thank you all for that support. And again, this is I'm enjoyed that I can come back and share the final product with you. So as everyone in this audience is well aware, there's an urgent need to decarbonize our economy, right, to mitigate the impacts of the climate crisis. So for historians, the question is, are there any precedents, right? What experiences do we have with low carbon energy at scale, and what were their trade-offs? So the key question that this book came out of, are there past examples of low carbon energy trade-offs to inform what is called now a just energy transition? And I wanted to start with hydropower because it is to date the biggest and sort of deepest source of low carbon energy. Now, this is from 2021. We need this to change urgently. So hopefully, going forward, that will not be the case. Wind and solar will explode, and we'll have a different ratio. But for the present, looking backwards, hydropower is sort of the deepest experience we have collectively with low carbon energy and some of its trade-offs. And so I was really curious to see what a history of hydropower might look like, framed in the context of the climate crisis and the energy transition. And there is, of course, a really deep literature on hydropower. This is just a small sample selection of some of the many books in this great literature. And I've sort of divided them into 3 parts here to highlight some of their key characteristics. Often people tend to write about sort of one dam. The books on the far left are a single dam. And these happen to be cases from Africa and Canada. Other books focus on entire river systems, like the Yellow River, the Colorado, the Columbia. Some focus on entire regions, such as the American West, or institutions like the Bureau of Reclamation in its effort to design and plan dams abroad. So a lot of this literature focuses on hydropower. It's as much about irrigation, municipal water supply as well. So there really is a deep literature on dams, but none of it is sort of calibrated to this question of the energy transition. And so as I was looking for a case study, I figured the first starting point should be, are there cases in which hydropower sort of makes up a large percentage of an electricity grid? So here's just to give you a sense of that. This is from the World Bank database, and it is showing countries that have more than 60% of their electricity from hydropower. And I put some cameos in there with the ones that just fall under that. So one of the things that might stand out to you of this is that Latin America is heavily represented in this diagram. Indeed, it is one of sort of the major arenas for hydropower history within the electricity grid. You can see, as I've highlighted here in this slide, it really stands out for having a high percentage of its electricity derived from hydropower. Secondly, I also figured it would be good to look at a country with scale, right? And while we can learn a lot from all of these case studies, one of the key crux of the energy transition is going to be at scale, right? Can we do this at scale? So I was really drawn to examples of countries that had produced not just a percentage of their electricity from hydropower, but also a high sort of gross quantity. And for that, we can see sort of 2 markers as as sort of stand-ins for energy consumption. One is population. So here's showing all the countries in the world greater than 200 million people, right? Large population consumes a lot of energy. The other one is, of course, the economy. And so I've listed the top 11 here. Brazil and Italy tied for 10. So, but it's, the idea was sort of just showing the sort of major world economies. And what you might sort of sense that this is building to is that there is sort of one constant in all of these, right? And again, this is back to the original slide, and that is Brazil, right? That sort of stands out among all these factors. So to me, it was really the ideal case study for looking at hydropower historically and its trade-offs. Indeed, Brazil is one of the world's biggest hydropower producers, second only to China in gross emissions. You might see some alarm bells going off, and this is from 2011, so it's outdated. This was around sort of the beginnings of this project, but I like the visual, so I've kept it. But the percentages haven't changed. The numbers have changed, but the Brazil's place in this has not. So Brazil, China, and Canada continue to be the big three, and Brazil, again, both in terms of gross emissions and also as a percentage, continues to be one of the world's biggest hydropower giants. It also, as this slide emphasizes, it has a deep history, right? This is not just a contemporary story, but as you can see, Brazilian hydropower at a really high percentage dates back to at least 1920, before that as well, but basically is in the early days of Brazil electrification to the present, it has not gotten less than 60% of its electricity, often no less than 80, 90% from hydropower. So it really has, this 100-year, a really deep history with that. The book that I wrote focuses on one period within this broader narrative, going back to give appropriate background and taking the story to the present. But its heart is really this period from the 1960s to the 1980s. It was a time when Brazil was under rule of a right-wing military dictatorship, and it built some of the country's biggest and most controversial dams. The inner concentric circle is sort of that main period. The wider one, again, is this sort of the antecedents, and then the period that follows that the book addresses as well alongside that. And these dams, again, built under a right-wing military dictatorship, big dams, big controversies. So I want to just pause here for a second and say, I hope that I've convinced you about why Brazil is an important case study in global energy history, and why it has tremendous contemporary relevance. So second, the question that follows is why this book and not another book about Brazilian hydropower dams. So similar to the slide that I showed earlier, there is, of course, a lot written about Brazilian hydropower, especially among Brazilians. There's a huge literature in Portuguese, right? People that have been living there have long observed and have written about these dams. And I want to highlight sort of two caveats to that might help inform where this book fits in. The first is that little of it has been written by historians. So a lot of this has been written by scientists, anthropologists, people from other fields, writing sort of from a contemporary perspective. So little of it is grounded in sort of the rich archival sources that are sort of the bread and butter of historians that would put this dam building boom in historical context, and that also sort of take the story to the present. Second characteristic is that almost all of it is fragmented, meaning that it tends to focus on just one dam, one case study, and not taking sort of the grid or the sort of continent as a scale. Sometimes stories even just focus on one aspect of that. So here, as an example, are two great books that have come out within the last few years. One by anthropologist Christine Folch and by historian Jacob Blanc that sort of illustrate this. They're both about the Itaipu Dam, one of the case studies that I look at in the book. Jacob Blanc's book, for example, just goes into the movement to fight for just indemnity at one of the dams at Itaipu, right? So there's this great literature, but it is sort of fragmented. And my goal was to, without sacrificing depth, to try to write this story at a bigger scale, again, calibrated to my original research question. So this is a modified map from the one in the book. This map in the book has a kick out, but I just want to give you an overview of the geography here that the book covers. It takes, the black dots are just the sort of bigger cohort of dams that the military government built that produced a high percentage of power. Again, the details are in the book, but the story focuses on 5 case studies. The Itaipu Dam in the southwest. It's a binational dam that Brazil built with Paraguay, then also under a right-wing military dictatorship. Sobradinho in Itaparica on the San Francisco River in the arid northeast, and then 2 dams in the Amazon rainforest, Tucuruí and Balbina. They were all built along similar timelines. They were all built from the same government, Brazilian government, state companies that built these dams. So they share that story. So in short, my book is to date the only English language environmental history of Brazilian hydropower, and it does it at the national level with global framing and deep research, which I'll talk about more later. So for the second part of this talk, I'm going to briefly, again, intentionally briefly, go through the content of the books, and then I'll conclude with some of its implications and contributions. But I want to just give you an overview here. The book's structured around 3 arguments, and it's organized sequentially, meaning that it's in part chronologically, but more importantly, right, that the dams, it begins with sort of the motivations for building the dams, the second part about what the state companies did to deal with environmental impacts, and then what those impacts were afterwards. So there's a sequence to the narrative. And the first part, covered in chapters 1 and 2, introduces the main protagonists of the dam building boom. As I mentioned, these were state companies, again, at this time during a dictatorship. And so it was a small cohort of military planners, military men and economic planners and engineers like those shown in these photos. These are some of the key, on the left-hand side, sort of politicians and diplomats, and on the right-hand, or that's the far side, engineers. And so one of the things that really stood out to me when I was doing this research is that, and it's something that we can discuss in greater detail, but this term pharaonic dams was sort of everywhere in the source, this allusion to pharaohs, right? This is a lot of the critics of the dams kept calling these dams pharaonic projects, and they were sort of alluding to the grandiose nature of the Egyptian pyramids and the pharaohs that built them. And so there's a famous line from Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, who called dams temples of modern India. And so in the book, I sort of married those 2 terms and called Brazilian dams temples of modern pharaohs, right? Alluding to the small cohort of military men and planners and engineers that were in charge of this dam building boom as sort of this clique of, again, so-called modern pharaohs. So that first section of the book introduces them. It argues that this group committed to building dams quickly and with little attention to social and environmental impacts. They did so because they saw economic growth as a form of political legitimacy for a military regime that had seized power illegally through a coup. They also were quite concerned with national integration in the context of the global Cold War in areas such as the Northeast and the Amazon that were comparatively less integrated into sort of the southeastern industrial urban core of Brazil. They saw sort of integrating them into the national fabric as really important. And they had the ideology very characteristic of sort of right-wing regimes at the time, that if they grew the pie, they didn't have to redistribute the pie. So that if they just generated economic growth, that would be enough. And so they didn't bother themselves too much with any social and environmental impacts that might befall people affected by these projects. But as the second part of this book explains, they couldn't ignore those completely, because the 1960s and 70s were a time of rising global environmentalism. They were, in Latin America, the time of liberation theology, a movement of sort of the left-wing Catholic Church that had that started fighting for social justice among the region's poorest people, and that included, in the case of Brazil, those affected and displaced by the big reservoirs of these big dams. So they had to do something about this. So the second part of the book and the second argument explains sort of what they did, and it concludes that the Brazilian military regime engaged in what I've called, again, building on that earlier term, pharaonic environmentalism. So they chose to play up the forms of environmental mitigation that would sort of earn them the most environmental clout, but for which they would have to invest the least in, and especially invest the least in terms of time and in terms of planning. So projects that they could do where they would not have to modify the plans and the format of the dam, nor modify the timeline. And so these animal rescue missions, which is what you're looking at here, I argue were sort of the culmination of that. They weren't the only piece of it, but it was sort of the culmination of that program. I don't have time to get into all sort of the details here. Again, something happy to talk about in Q&A. But the idea was that they sent teams of rescuers to go rescue animals off treetops when the reservoirs flooded. Meant they could just sort of proceed as they were with the dams, and they would hopefully get some good PR from this. Of course, most of the animals sort of fled of their own volition beforehand. A lot of them ended up dying afterwards because they were traumatized and put into environments with animals that were already there anyway. So it became sort of more flash than substance in this respect. And importantly, which I'll translate this caption on the right here, it says on the top, the Arca de Itaipu, Indio no entra, which is Itaipu's Ark, indigenous people not welcome. So there was an opportunity cost to these, because investing in these, the dictatorship did not invest much in fairly compensating displaced people, as this cartoon, which was written to accompany a report from an indigenous supporter of the Ava Guarani, who were displaced by Itaipu. They invested comparatively less in programs for indigenous people and to mitigate some of the other impacts. So it became this showpiece environmental project. Now, the last part of the book talks about what actually happened, the fallout of these projects. So I have two chapters, as you can see here, right? Chapter 4 on the social impacts, and then Chapter 5, the environmental impacts, that go into this in detail. The third and final argument sort of brings the story sort of back around, is that the unmitigated impacts were very damaging and inspired a backlash against hydropower. So these dams displaced large numbers of people. Here you're seeing images from groups that were displaced by the Itaparica Dam in the northeast. The left side here is the farmers that were displaced. On the right side is the Tusha, an indigenous group who to date still does not have their land. So there was tremendous sort of social trauma that came with these dams. In other cases, and this is moving on to Chapter 5 now, which covers the environmental impacts, there had a huge footprint on the non-human environment as well. Here you're seeing a photo of Sechiquedas, or Guaira Falls, as it is in English. It was once the world's largest waterfall by volume. If anyone's been to Iguazu Falls, the famous falls are still there now. This was about 100 kilometers upstream. It was reportedly 20 times greater in volume. Again, the largest waterfall in the world by volume. As a national park at the time, flooded by the Itaipu Dam. And it generated a huge backlash and a bunch of controversies. So the final two chapters highlight the backlash that I mentioned that started to form in response to these dams and their impacts. Chapter 6 highlights Balbina Dam, which is in the Amazon, a very infamous case study that even the engineers, the opening line of that chapter is even the engineers turned on Balbina. They called it, quote unquote, yet another pharaonic dam. So it even incurred the wrath of the engineering class. And then Chapter 7 talks about the anti-dam movement, the national anti-dam movement that formed in response to all this. Here you're seeing two photos from the literature on Balbina at the top. And then at the bottom, a really iconic photo from a Callapao protest against the plans of the Belamonte Dam, which did get built decades later. This was in 1989, sort of at the early years of this big anti-dam movement. All right. I know I'm speeding through it, but thanks for bearing with me here. I'm approaching the end. So I want to close with some contributions. And first and foremost, what I hope for this book is that it brings environmental history and the story of Brazilian dams to a wide audience. So I've attempted to write this accessibly and to sort of reach a diverse audience, hopefully, as this participation here attests to. But for those with more familiarity with the field, with dams, with social and environmental justice literature, maybe even these dams themselves, people for whom the basic sort of narrative arc that I've outlined is familiar, I want to offer sort of some following concluding points. One, and this is the contribution I'm most proud of, is that this book brings to bear a lot of new evidence to the story. So evidence not just in terms of quantity, but also in quality. I visited 40 archives for this, most of them underutilized. I got in, by both persistence and luck, I was able to get into the archives of the state companies that built these dams. And in other cases, the personal papers of engineers and politicians. I also visited sort of smaller repositories of advocates and scientists, personal papers of people who would organize protests on behalf of these dams, many of them associated with the liberation theology movement within the Catholic Church. And then I also used some sort of classic government intergovernmental archives, the archives of the World Bank, for example, and elsewhere. So there's really a deep research behind this, and what that enabled me to do was to build a narrative that had greater depth, right? To add depth to both the narrative and the arguments. Documents like this one, which are the Ava Guaranese, that group that you saw referenced on the slide earlier, the animal rescues. This is their one of the letters, many letters they wrote to the World Bank in 1986, protesting their sort of dire state after the government displaced them and then didn't properly compensate them as it was legally obligated to do so in Brazilian law. So there's really sort of a rich documentary base that is behind this dam. Secondly, I hope that this contributes to a bunch of different debates, right? There's not sort of one takeaway. I hope that sort of different people with a different stake in the story can get different things out of it. So there's a lot this can say about the controversial legacy of Brazil's military dictatorship in Brazilian history. That is something that's the pros and cons are continually debated. So I hope that this case study adds to that. There is a debate that I became more familiar with going through sort of the revision process for this manuscript, and especially I think in political science, but around other fields as well, about the authoritarian environmentalism, about what authoritarianism can do for the goals of decarbonization. So this book sort of weighs in on that a little bit. There's a long-standing debate about dams as political objects, trying to see them more as just engineering feats, but the political context in which they operate in and how that shapes what projects are built under what circumstances. Of course, the debate about the climate crisis and discussions about the Anthropocene as well, right? This new era of the humanity's relationship with the environment, of which re-engineering rivers and building big dams is a huge part of. So, to conclude, I want to return where I started, and that's the debate about the climate crisis and the energy transition. And I want to do so with this final map here. I think it flags two important points that I want to leave you with. One is the importance. I hope that this book highlights the importance of knowing context and history as we talk about any sort of major engineering project and dams in particular, and why this map matters. And let me just pause and say all the black dots you're seeing are the dams that were planned but not built. And you can look at the key for the other designations, but I just want to highlight that. But again, context and history are hugely important, and the Amazon highlights that. Because dams are talked about as low carbon energy. Indeed, that's what I framed this whole talk around. Most of them are, some of them are not. And in fact, dams in the Amazon emit methane at really high rates, sometimes equivalent or exceeding that of coal-fired power plants. And that's because as vegetation decomposes in a deep reservoir in the anoxic bottom layer where there's no oxygen, that all that vegetation, which is dense in the Amazon, turns into methane and then gets funneled out the spillway or the turbines, and then like when you release the soda bottle cap, it all comes up afterwards. So context, history, really important to understanding that. This is often not the case. I actually was just at a talk this past week in Princeton on called Leapfrogging the Amazon. There was a panel on dams, right? And this often gets sort of swept under the rug. So, right, I think that deep history is important to understand that. And secondly, and I also want to give a shout out. I'm thankful, Dustin, that you're here because I can sort of acknowledge you for a phrase I borrowed from you. I can sort of give you credit publicly now. In this room, actually, I was for a long time. I was trying to figure out, what are the layers of motivation for doing this project and why does this all matter? So what? And when Dustin was talking about his own work, he said it was really important for maintaining the political momentum for decarbonization. And to me, that is really what's at the heart of this project and why anyone should care about this story and investing in it. So my concluding point is that I think the story of Brazilian hydropower dams shows that we can expect a backlash from poorly planned low-carbon energy projects with high impacts. Therefore, it's important to invest in social and environmental justice, not just for its own sake, which it is, but also for maintaining the political momentum for decarbonization. Thank you.
So I think,
yeah,
you want me to start?
Yeah, I'll turn it over to you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matt. I first want to thank you for inviting me to be a part of this panel with my wonderful colleagues here. And I want to congratulate you on this book. It is such a richly and dense book that illustrates, you can see where the 40 archives came into being. But I want to start with a detail in your introduction that then becomes part of a later chapter. There's a detail in the introduction that made me pause and think. It is about the loss of sound, the roar of giant waterfalls that once they're flooded, there's complete silence. The rumble of water was so loud that it could be heard a town over, and the silence that followed was disorienting, not just to humans, but to non-human animals. And Matt Johnson tells us that he wants to metaphorically bring back that noise, not to the town dwellers, but rather to the urban residents who have profited from electric power. And I thought that was such an elegant connection to be making, to have us think about silence as a way to bring back the noise, and how he then brings back, and what the noise means in this book is so elegantly put forward. We're talking about the Catholic Church, we're talking about mosquitoes, we're talking about military regime, we're talking about development, and we're talking about social justice and injustice. So as he states, and I quote you, "I want to replace the soft hum of electrified cities with the roar of powerful waterfalls, the silence of turning on a light switch and charging a cell phone with the shouts and protest of displaced communities." And end quote. And he follows us to the reasons why. Quote again, "Those sounds, in turn, should serve as a constant reminder that metropolitan and electrified rural areas remain deeply connected to distant environments and communities that live there despite our ostensible distance from them," end quote. That's where I wanted to start my comments, because I think something that isn't so apparent is the connection that we make, or that we lose the connection when we don't see rural areas in the urban spaces, and how present rural, remote areas are in our everyday life. And in order to have the life that we have, not just in Brazil, but here, what that means for faraway rivers and dams and people who've been displaced, in order for us to have the life that we have in our urban spaces. So this point I thought was very important, and it's one of those rich points that I find a bit hidden in the narrative, which is comparing the rural and the urban to understand the complexity of what development means for one, and underdeveloping the other. Let me repeat that. What developing one means when you're underdeveloping the other. In many ways, Johnson's book has become more pertinent. Though it examines multiple dams in Brazil built during the infamous military dictatorship, it is also an examination of how an authoritarian regime built or negated a relationship with environmentalism. The aim of the regime was, quote, "economic development at all costs," end quote. But it had to contend with a growing and incipient environmental movement, both abroad and at home. So there's this wonderful convergence where you have the rise of a military regime, which is at its height of its power, and this building of massive infrastructures, where at the same time, the world is pausing and saying, we should care more about the environment. And so what does a military regime do at this moment? And this is another rich point of your book. Because when we think about the displacement of indigenous groups, the displacement of rural people in Latin America in general, and Brazil in particular, we tend to think of the Amazon, that it's cattle ranchers, that it's for the quest for land that we lose. That is why people are displaced. What Matt is offering us is that it's water that's displacing, that the desert is becoming a water, because you begin your book with Canudos, this massacre of the 1800s of a utopian community that was being built. But then toward the middle of your book, you return to this image of massacre and water, but you start it with Guatemala as a reminder that dams are not, even though this is a book about Brazil, that the pursuit of hydroelectric power is a pursuit that has created massacres throughout the region. And in Rio Negro, which flooded entire communities, but also led to another military regime creating a massacre. So one of my first questions is about the memory of these indigenous communities. And though there was not a massacre as there was in Guatemala, there was a different type of killing of memories. And if you could address that a bit, you do so beautifully in the book. The other, I really love that you bring up the notion of environmental authoritarianism, which you define as the use of environmental policies to maintain authoritarian rule. And what I didn't expect from your book was a really detailed historiography of the rise of a military regime. And we tend to think of Brazil's authoritarian regime in the context of the fall of democracy in Latin America in the mid-20th century, or the rise of authoritarian regimes, but also repressive governments, the disappearance of individuals, the targets of universities and students, which unfortunately, as I was reading this, seemed a little too close for comfort as it has in the last few months. But what you were showing us was this relationship that I had not thought of a military regime with its billing itself as almost an environmental regime, and how it is impossible to maintain that if you're not maintaining social justice as well. So social justice is tied in with environmental justice. I just have a couple more things to say. So this is a beautifully written and richly detailed narrative. And Matt, you lay out a complicated story in a wonderfully easy to comprehend canvas, where, as I said earlier, you speak about indigenous people, but also mosquitoes, the fauna that is rescued, and surprisingly, the role of the Catholic Church. And this was something that I was not expecting. As someone who works on Latin America, liberation theology is something that's at the foreground, especially in this time period, but I did not expect liberation theology to play such a role in your book. So that was my other question. Could you elaborate a bit more, especially for those who haven't read the book, how the bishop and how these local priests begin to see their defense of the poor as a part of the defense of the environment, which is not novel in other places, but it takes on such a Brazilian turn here. So I was hoping that maybe you could elaborate on that. One other question I had, all of these dams are built around the same time, and my question is about maintenance. What's happening to these dams today? In the area that I work in, which is a desert, the dams aren't being repaired because the rivers have died, and the dams are basically empty. So there's serious problems with dam maintenance, and I was wondering if you could address that. And the indigenous people, you said that in your book you mentioned that there's still this ongoing fight for the lands that they've lost, and it's been a decades-long battle. I was wondering if you could update us about that. This is very much a story that I would place within development narratives in terms of their borrowing from the World Bank, they're borrowing from the IMF to build these pharaonic dams. But it's not necessarily, you don't necessarily foreground it as a story of development aid or as a story of development in general. So I was wondering, now that your book is finished, how would you place this within, or would you not, within a larger development narrative that spans across the world, both latitudes and longitudes in the region? Overall, as I said at the beginning, I congratulate you for an incredibly complex, richly researched, and really beautifully written book. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you, Gabriela. We're going to collect all the comments first, and then I'll just take notes and I can respond at the end. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Matt, for this wonderful book, for the opportunity to sort of get to know you during your time here and know your work, and to sort of, I feel so delighted and proud to be able to hold this book here in my hands and to sort of read it closely. So congratulations on this exciting new book. So in this book, you have produced this really exemplary study of energy infrastructures as political form, as environmental assemblages, and sort of as social catastrophe. Your concept that I was really sort of chewing a lot last night, in particular on your idea of pharaonic environmentalism, thinking just how vividly and sharply it comes through the pages, how it captures the ways that these the Brazilian authoritarian state engaged staged ecological caution and care as spectacle. And I was interested in, and maybe I'll reflect a little bit more on the spectacle of large technological systems in my remarks. So in your telling, Brazil's military regime, did things like rescue animals for the cameras, even as it flooded these forests and displaced indigenous communities and submerged entire ways of life beneath these waters. And here, I mean, I thought, as there were so many resonances with the coal story that I was so familiar with in East Asia. I've written about both cases. We see this kind of fantasy of limitless energy and the idea that the strength of the state might be indexed by its ability to control nature at scale. We see how these technical institutions became instruments of statecraft, how engineers and planners became agents of political legitimation, and how infrastructural ambition would produce these zones of sacrifice. And going back to Gabriela's point about the rural and the urban often far from the metropole, but these costs of accessing electricity, these ecological, social, or cultural, are borne by those with little say and less redress. So as I mentioned, I was really struck by the performativity of the environmentalism that you mentioned. These acts not being merely cynical, but really constitutive of what you call pharaonic rule. This vision of the state as both destroyer and savior. This kind of contradiction, the very entity that manufactures crisis and then performs its alleviation. And I think here you sort of, I was taken by how you invite to ask, what's the function of environmental discourse within these sort of authoritarian systems? When does ecological rhetoric become a substitute for ecological thought and ecological thinking? So, I mean, this is not only a history of politics and energy. It's also this, as you've put it so well by the end of your presentation today, a cautionary tale of our present. As we are repeatedly told, we must transition to low carbon energy and do so quickly to maintain the sort of political momentum of decarbonization. You also sort of remind us that speed, scale, and carbon savings do not guarantee justice and may in fact repeat some of these earlier patterns of displacement and devastation this time under a green flag. So I have a couple of questions for you, and some of it's comparative with the carbon energy regime. And so maybe the first one is, how might we sort of compare the epistemic claims of hydropower to those of fossil fuel regimes? Both involve things like promises of growth, predictive modeling, the mobilization of technical and technocratic expertise. But does water lend itself to different fantasies, different politics than coal or oil? And if so, what's at stake in those differences? So that's my first question. My second sort of relates to your second last chapter on Balbina, and how it emerges as both this culmination in the larger narrative and this point of collapse where these as a hydropower project that is so questionable that it breaks the regime's dam building model. And you caution here that climate discourses may also rehabilitate such projects under new guise. So what does the afterlife of Balbina in particular teach us about the temporal logic of carbon or hydro-based developmentalism? Are such regimes ever truly abandoned or merely rebranded? And if you have time for one last question, it goes back to my sort of how taken I was by the pharaonic environmentalism. So much of your critique of this centers on this, the superficiality that underlies this fixation with spectacle. But what the engineers and planners themselves believe about the dams they built, what epistemologies of energy, of ecology, of development helped shape their worldview? Did you find technocratic rationalities around geological certainty, calorific logic, belief in infinite extraction that I've seen in the sort of coal and oil case in East Asia expressed here rather through water instead? So those are some thoughts and questions. But congratulations once again on a really exciting book.
Thank you for sharing.
Great. So, like the others, I want to just reinforce that I found this to be a great book. I'm a political scientist and not a historian. Oftentimes when I read history, I feel like I am being inundated with sort of facts and dates and don't really know what to do with them. In this book, it was the exact opposite. I felt like we had a set of historical observations that were woven together in a coherent sort of political economy narrative of what happened and with potent predictions about what could happen. And so that's not easy to do. Furthermore, it's not easy to do and make it be an interesting and lively read. This was a read that not only was clear and accessible, but there was tension throughout with great storylines. So it was, dare say, entertaining to read. I don't know if we're allowed to say that in academia, but I was genuinely entertained reading it. You had storylines ranging from the role of the Catholic Church. You had a storyline around international power politics with Paraguay and, regimes sort of, kind of butting heads, kind of not butting heads, trying to work with each other. You had a tension that is fundamental around can we have cheap, abundant, clean energy and not face significant justice considerations? That is not only good scholarship, but it was actually deeply engaging to read. I also like the fact that you centered the role of politics as the sort of primal sort of underlying force rather than just a sort of more technocratic treatment of, here's the engineering, here's the optimal place to do something, etc. And then finally, I think one of the things that this book reinforces, which is an area that I've done some work on, is that the notion of compensation is hard. It's difficult to actually pull off. And in my view, the reason for that is that compensation that would be necessary to sort of compensate those being displaced, that would have to take place in such large volumes and over long periods of time that very few, even democratic political regimes, are ever able to do it. Right? So my most recent book basically says that this world of where we say, hey, here's some policy, it's going to make most of us better off, there are going to be those who lose out, I did not say losers, but those who might lose out, let's just compensate them based on all the benefits, growing the pie. We rarely see that happening, right? Because it is politically hard to do so. It takes a degree of commitment that is often lacking. And we see that squarely in play here in this book. Furthermore, I think this book highlights that there are some dimensions for which it would be impossible to somehow materially compensate because we were fundamentally displacing people from lands that they and their ancestors had occupied. And so I think it's, in that sense, it's a deeply intriguing political economy book, albeit written from a historical perspective. Maybe I'll just move briefly to some commentary before turning it over to you and the audience. One big question I had is centers around this debate around environmental authoritarianism or authoritarian environmentalism, which is a nice sort of pivot and move you make, is, really how much better could something get, right? If we have some sort of mandate to deploy infrastructure that will create the electrons that we need to decarbonize our economy, what institutions do we think will actually be able to accomplish this balancing act behind building and building big and maintaining some modicum of justice insofar as it impacts individual communities that might not be the masses. And I think that we see this today, even in fully, in other words, like, it wasn't always clear to me how much this was per se about an authoritarian government, rather than just any government who had like big aspirations and saw that this would be one way to do it. And if a minority of people get displaced, well, that's just what happens. So I think that this will continue to reinforce that sort of tension about our democratic institutions and precisely how our democratic institutions better suited to play a role here. I think there's also a backdrop here, which is, while we have talked about dams and hydropower, one of the things that we will see in the future is around the role of storage of energy, not just the production of energy. And so you started with some little known facts, and I'll give another little known fact. In the U.S., we have our biggest source of storage of energy that is not molecular in basis is pumped hydro. You basically pump hydro up, you pump water up, some elevation, and then when you using, say, solar or wind, et cetera, when it's abundant and it's not being used, and then when you need it, you just let it flow and you generate a bunch of energy again. So this is like a gigantic battery, if you will. Well, it turns out that a number of pumped hydro projects have not necessarily been as justice-oriented as they otherwise might. And so the broader backdrop, I think, in the future will be not just the production of energy through free-flowing water, but how we think about using hydrological resources as a form of storage, and hopefully in a way that maybe does not recreate some of the justice considerations so exemplified in the book. Finally, I think it's important for us to situate Brazil moving forward in a larger international economy in which it exists. The Brazilians will be hosting the next COP and are also very active in thinking about what will their economy look like in a world where they all of a sudden become much more economically competitive with given institutions like the European Union's carbon border adjustment mechanism, basically a tariff on carbon. Well, a world in which Brazil can be a manufacturer of all sorts of things and export them to markets that now penalize the carbon intensity, they're going to be relying on hydro even more, and they've told me as such. So will that mean that we will be seeing a world of building out more hydrological resources, especially because some are no longer active? And how will that happen? So my guess is that the types of issues that you talk about in this book happened in the past, but they're going to be salient for the future as well.
Thank you so much, Dustin. Wow. Thank you all. It's I deeply appreciate it. That's thanks for such kind feedback and for such insightful comments on my work. I have so many notes here that I don't think I can possibly get through them in 10 minutes, but I'll try, and then I want to turn it over to the audience for questions. So speaking of justice and injustice, I'm going to do injustice to your questions because I won't be able to respond to them as fully as I would like to. But again, I will try my best. I might as well take them in order because I don't see any other obvious way. So Gabriela, thanks again. You asked about the memory of indigenous communities in particular. It's interesting. So one of the challenges of the book was because I had 5 different case studies, right? Trying to, these are 5 different communities, right? These are 5 different groups. So I mean, it really varies on case-by-case basis, and I've struggled, as I've talked about this book since it's been out, to sort of speak for, all of them at a whole, right? So I think it really varies. Some communities, the trauma is real. All communities is real. Excuse me. The trauma is sort of real on the day-to-day basis, right? Like the Tusha, who I showed up there, they're still fighting for their land. I mean, it's been, it's enormously tragic. They call the people of that community my age call themselves a generation without land because they've now grown up their whole life without land. And so in other cases like the Vaimediatori, which was displaced by Balbina, that dam has sort of the ironic feature of, because it was built. I also meant to say in my presentation, I sort of sped through it, but Balbina was built just when Brazil returned to democracy. So it was started by the dictatorship. It was finished then by by a sort of more democratic regime. And in any case, because it had become under such bad light, the government actually responded most favorably, right? Its program to help the Vaimediatori was comparatively the best, and so they actually got a lot of compensation. They had sort of just before the dam was finished, they had suffered through a highway that was built through their territory in a tin mine that amounted to genocide, in which their population had dwindled significantly, and the compensation from the Balbina Dam actually helped them materially improve, right? And so while the trauma is still there, that has been offset by to Dustin's point, I don't think you could ever fully compensate, but just that there was a difference there. So I just think that it varies, and I think there are different elements of it you can see in these cases. Liberation theology, I also didn't expect that when I started the story. True, that was one of the fascinating parts that jumped out to me. And yeah, I mean, they really, the point that I think would be most helpful for the audience is that it mattered under dictatorship, because the Catholic Church, because they were associated with that, they could get away with protesting in a way that other people couldn't. So at Itaipu, for example, there was famously a journalist who was arrested for basically criticizing the government and its handling of the displaced farmers there, and he was jailed for 2 years. And so this was a dictatorship that sort of went after dissidents, right? And so because priests and bishops and all that were associated with the church, right? They could help in a way that other people couldn't. So it ended up playing a huge role. Also surprised me. Maintenance, state of dams today. Another tricky part of the book. So one of the biggest issues. So I will say this: that these dams are hugely important in the grid. I think if any dam is getting maintained, it's these ones. Especially Balbina. Maybe an exception, but I can't speak on that authoritatively, because that information is behind closed doors with the electricity company. So the short answer is I have no idea. But I would, as I put in there, I mean, these were not, this is the phrase from the book, these were not boondoggles. I mean, these were very well built and engineered dams. And so I have every reason to believe that they're sort of well maintained. The one issue is sedimentation. So dams, rivers carry sediments along with water, and they tend to fill up slowly. Places like China and Puerto Rico and the Caribbean writ large, right? There's heavy rates of sedimentation. That was something I really wanted to find good information on, and the latest information I found was from the 90s. And they have about 100 to 200 year timeline, at least at that rate. So I don't know. The answer is I don't know. But for the time being, until I find other information, I'm inclined to think that they're doing okay. Status of the indigenous fights, as I mentioned, the Tusha still fighting. I gave a similar talk about a month ago now, and was told that the Ava Guarani, and I've looked it up and followed it, the Ava Guarani displaced by Itaipu Dam in the southwestern Brazil, just after, again, 40 plus years, just got some land back. It's still in the process of being, turned over, but there's a new development as of a month ago, promising. So that's huge. They're also a generation that had been without land. So positive development in that regard. The development story, I'm looking at the clock, something I could talk a lot about, but to say that I'm glad that came up for you, because I do think that is, as anyone writes a book, right, you have to sort of choose the narrative framing of it, but I think that that's in there. And so I'm glad that even if it's not sort of, those terms are not sort of at the forefront, that it speaks to that, and that it adds information to that. So I'll stop there with those comments. Victor, thanks so much for all your comments as well. Again, just a huge honor to follow you on this panel. The comparison with fossil fuels. I think about this often because, especially, there's fossil fuels have really been at the heart of the Anthropocene and this, right, the industrial world. But they're not the lowest common denominator, right? And so when I teach, I get taught the energy history class, right? And I teach. To me, it's really sort of it's high energy, because I think about nuclear too, right? Nuclear also doesn't fit. It's important, but it doesn't quite neatly fit the carbonization, the carbon narrative. So something I've thought about a lot, and I don't know if I've settled on a catchy term, but I think high energy society. I mean, there's the common denominator really is high energy, whether it's produced through water and gravity, or whether it's nuclear, splitting fusion, or whether it is burning fossil fuels. I mean, I think there are they share a lot of similarities, as you highlighted. The one thing as far as different fantasies, and this is just, I had not considered this very deeply before, but I wonder if there's a slight difference there, at least in terms of the number of dam sites, because fossil fuels, right, wherever you can find them, they're sort of, they offer this limitless fantasy, as Victor talks about in his book. I mean, dams, I think they're on a site-by-site basis, yes, the waterfall's there. It's, if anything, it's perhaps more less limits, because sedimentation notwithstanding, it's perpetual, right? Unlike fossil fuels, but there are sort of X number of good dam sites, right? There's not sort of endless number of. Whereas, I imagine geologists like to think there's sort of a continuous font of fossil fuels, not eventually, of course, but at least in sort of short, medium term. So, anyways, food for thought for later. I don't have a prepackaged answer. Engineers and the worldview. I can say more about Babina if you want Q&A, but I'm gonna speed through and just get to the one about engineers and worldview. You might be interested if this speaks to this. When I did research for this, so in addition to the archives, I did about 10 plus interviews, and I intentionally sort of ad hoc snowballed, just if I came across people. I sought out interviews when and where the documentary trail petered. So like for malaria and mosquitoes, for example, there sort of ran out of sources there, but I had found access to a bunch of people who worked in that field, so I just talked to them and they filled in the story. So in any case, I came across an engineer, one of the head engineers for Soto Jam in the 70s, and he just happened to be passing through the archive when I was there, and he was willing to talk to me. He shared his papers. We had a conversation, but I had this kind of formal sheet from the university that explained my project and had the title and all that, and he looked at it, and the dissertation's title, as I alluded to, is Temples of Modern Pharaohs. And as I mentioned, in Brazil, this pharaonic term, it's loaded. It's mostly critical. I have actually found a couple of cases where it's used with a positive connotation. They're rare, but I have found them. They exist, where the common denominator is just the pyramids of Egypt, the sort of grandiosity of it. But it's mostly critical, almost always critical. And so he looked at the paper and said, "I don't agree with this title. I don't think you should change this." And I said, "Oh, great. Let's talk about it." And he said, "Well, in my mind, the pyramids are useless. They don't have a use, so but the dams that we all built, and he was very candid about they're traumatic in the short term, but in the long term, right? I mean, this is someone who cared about, it wasn't just totally writing off the impacts, but the worldview was that there's utility, there's sort of this utility trade-off. And of course, I was saying this to my dissertation advisor, John McNeil, who said, well, if you believe in ancient Egyptian religion, the pyramids are in fact useful. So there's some different utility, but in terms of the industrial worldview, right? So I think very much there is a shared worldview among the engineering and planners that maybe resembles what you came across in East Asia and in the coal economy there as well. Dustin, again, thanks for joining this panel, for the comments. It means a lot. Again, also to have the interdisciplinary perspective on this panel, right? In the interest of mirroring the vision of Hughes and all that, I'm really honored. Let's see. So one institutions, and this is it's a question that I will probably continue to think about. The one about what institutions are sort of best calibrated for this, because it really is at the heart of the book. And I think you're correct in that this is not just a story of authoritarianism. I often I tell people is that it's a book about Brazilian dams, so I couldn't sort of bring it all in, but I do try to globalize it throughout each chapter. And the United States in the 1930s and 40s, right, in the Pacific Northwest. I mean, it's not. I want to make it clear for the audience that there's no shortage of cases where democratic regimes have built dams so equally traumatic. And in that sense, to me, one of the things, again, as a historian, right, I think the timelines also matter here, because regardless of institutions, there is a sort of changing timeline. And so it is the dams in the U.S. that were most traumatic were built pre popular environmentalism and social justice movement, whereas the Brazilian dams were built sort of right in the thick of this. So I think time to me matters as much as political momentum. And I do think the authoritarianism, if it's not sort of the driving force for these inequalities, I mean, I do think it added a layer. And that's the point that I try to make in the book, right, is that it did discourage protest, right? It did discourage people from advocating for more justice. I mean, the case you alluded to about Paraguay is this Brazilian engineer, it's the subject in one of the chapters, planned a dam upstream of this waterfall that would have spared it. And he was able to protest because he was an eminent engineer, but he got nowhere, right? And so I think the authoritarianism did add a layer, even if it wasn't the main piece. But So are democratic institutions better calibrated? I think so. I also think there's a host of other trade-offs that come with, authoritarianism. Even if one could argue, which I don't necessarily think you can, that they were somehow better for environmentalism, right? In terms of just forcing through urgently needed carbonization projects. But to me, it all comes back to actually that line that I heard you say that I was, when I was, sitting here for Youth Dinner Lunch, which is I think the better democratic governments can do, even if they can't do everything, right? They can't fully, create a benign project. The better they can do in compensating, even if they end up coming up short, the better they'll be able to maintain that political momentum. Because I've seen that. I mean, I've seen when I was here in the last couple of years, my time at Harvard, there was that Audubon study about the deforesting, cutting down forests to build solar panels in Massachusetts, right? That was Georgetown, where I did my PhD, came under fire for cutting down forests to build its solar panels too. So I mean, you see this real time, and I do think that that's an important part of this. Pump storage, great, and it's great to flag the future forward thinking about the Brazilian economy and the low carbon world. I hadn't really considered that at depth, so that's I'm thankful you put it on my radar. It's something I'll be thinking about. Thank you again. And now I can open it all up for questions for the last 10 minutes.
I have just one comment and one question. And prior to my comment and question, I want to thank Gabriela, because it was from Gabriela I learned that many decades ago an Indian contributed to the breadbasket of Mexico, which most Indians in India do not know. I mentioned your name in my talk in India, which they were appreciated.
Thank you so much.
So now, you showed the picture of India, the oldest functional dam for more than 1,000 years, functional dam, is in South India. There may be other dams which are even much older in Europe or elsewhere, but oldest one in South India for irrigation purpose. And these days, because of the population explosion, every state wants to save their water wherever the river originates. And the states start fighting now, because if one state puts the dam, then the other state, so now it doesn't get the water, it's a problem. So now, it was during British time they used that a waterfall in South India for electric power, but such waterfalls are very, very, very few in number in India. So coming back, I never thought the other side of the effect. When you construct dams, then about the environment. I never thought I'm a biologist here, so I never paid it. I was always appreciating about hydropower in Costa Rica and elsewhere. Only when your talk came, then I started realizing, yes, there is another negative aspect of that hydropower. So now, regardless of that authoritarian aspect and Catholic Church's opposition to it, how about the jobs? That's what did common people were they helped with the job opportunities? And if one is opposing it, then what is the alternative provided by? Because people need job.
Right.
So that's one.
Great. I can probably collect a few questions and then I'll all together. Yeah.
Thanks, So yeah, I'm neither a political scientist nor a historian nor an expert in Brazil, but I have a much wider question that relates to how the lessons from the book may apply to the US. And I think I would totally agree with Dustin that the type of infrastructure that needs to get built is way wider than just dams.
Oh yeah.
And I think that actually probably anything that makes it easier to build in the United States is probably good for the energy transition. Principally, I'm thinking about high-speed rail and transmission lines, because probably the main barrier to new renewable energy generation in the United States at the moment is interconnection. So really, if you can make it easier to build transmission lines, it hugely helps. On the American right, for a very long time, I think there's been the view that a stronger state makes it harder to build, because you're crowding out the private sector, or you have too many regulations. And actually, I think like the current political thought on the what you could call the left in the Democratic Party, I'm thinking of Ezra Klein and Abundance, is basically the same thing. It's the reason we're not able to build transmission and we're not able to build high-speed rail is because the state is getting in the way with way too many regulations, particularly environmental reviews. And then when I'm applying this to your work, it's like almost the opposite of what I get from your talk, which is that it's not actually that it would be easier for the state to build if it were more authoritarian. And there are downsides to building transmission line. You probably lower the value of people's homes, and you probably have to remove them. But then I think, the political valence at the moment is that there's too much state, and the more the state is involved in the construction process, the harder it is to build. And I wonder if in your research, maybe any of the panel, like how this compares between certainly what the dominant narrative is in the United States versus what you found in the book.
Thanks.
I think my question kind of ties in with this one nicely, which is essentially how well did this go in Brazil? So like on the spectrum of how bad we could have done in terms of environmental outcomes, human development outcomes, probably we weren't on the worst path, but probably we also weren't on the best path. So is there any kind of lessons to learn from this period of authoritarian Brazil? Were they listening to technocrats a lot, or was it a lot of fickle decisions from leaders above that made decisions about how this infrastructure was built and where?
So how was it go in Brazil? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your presentation, for your books. I mean, it seems to be very interesting. I'll read it. I'm from Spain, and when you showed this map at the beginning with the spots with all the electric or power, hydroelectric power production, I didn't see any of the spots on Spain.
Was Spain missing?
Which, well, I mean, thinking about Europe, maybe it's one of the countries with most hydropower production. So it's just a question of taking that into account. Yeah.
So I have a very I'm a historian of Inner Asia, but about 800 years ago, looking at state impositions of infrastructure, and I'm really interested in the generation of records on the mortality that comes from displacement, especially in terms of infrastructure. So I'm wondering, you mentioned animal mortality, right, and how this was sort of being propagandized.
Yeah.
And I'm interested in what is sort of the logic of the generation of records for human health impacts and animal health impacts, mortality or disease. When are they generated? What are they being used for? What are they being mobilized for? Are they part of political resistance later?
Okay. Great. All right, I can take all those. Thank you all so much for the questions. Let me just finalize my notes here. Okay, wonderful. So, question about jobs and employment, right? With these dams. Yeah, I mean, there's no question, and this actually speaks to Colleen's question as well about sort of how well did they go. And you were asking also in terms of not just the environmental trade-offs, but the dams themselves, right? Is that?
We kind of, so Eli's bringing up, the market sort of idea of like the government's out of the way versus this is the government is very much the decision maker. And like how well did we do with that?
I see. This is okay. Anyway, but yeah, so I mean, I think one of the important points that I try not to lose in the book, because especially in environmental history and I mean in general, right, it's really easy to just kind of focus on what didn't go well, the negative points, right, and lose sight of all the benefits that came out of it. So I tried to be very conscious as I wrote this to tell, I mean, to some extent, as balanced a story as I can. So there's, the conclusion opens up with so are dams good or bad, and it weighs some of the trade-offs, right? And I mean, the answer is sort of in sort of the broadest sense. I mean, they were good, right? I mean, Brazil is mostly urbanized. This provides electricity for people, for jobs, for hospitals, for all the whole economy, right? Essentially. So I think in that sense, they were quite successful in that. They did. I mean, the construction jobs of the dam, only lasted as long as the project lasted, right? And in most cases, they had, the impacts were, as to Gabriela's comments, right, were felt in the consuming, in big cities, right, as opposed to like the people displaced by the dam. They didn't, get as much job or employment afterwards. And really, the people, as Chapter 4 discusses, the people that did the best that were displaced were the ones that were best able to adapt to an urban setting, which most of them didn't come from, right? A lot of them were floodplain farmers and et cetera. And so in the deeper sense, in one sense, yes, they were successful. They brought jobs, brought economic growth. The point that I wanted to make, and to Gabriela's point, right, is that they're often, for people to the beneficiaries of that, lose sight of that the question is not, what was the net benefit, but for who benefited and why, and what could be done about it. So, how well did this go? And state involvement. So I think, I mean, you're correct, and this is sort of the opposite story. This is a government company, right? Unlike sort of modern U.S. sense, right? This is a state dictatorship that was building it. So I think it just adds diversity to the case studies that we have, right, in terms of models. And again, not that one should just sort of pick out the model. I think military authoritarian environmentalism is a terrible model. But just to say that there is, right, that there is. I'm just emphasizing that you're correct, and that this is sort of the flip side. To get stuff built, I mean, again, it sounds sort of, I'm anticipating it sounding unsatisfying as I say it, but I really come back to that point where I just think that the better, the smarter, one can sort of plan and anticipate what the impacts are going to be, and making sure that the projects are done as best they can. I just think it goes a long way. Like that case that I learned about in this room years ago about the solar panels in Massachusetts, right? The takeaway from that study, the Audubon. Do you remember who else was? Okay, in any case, I'm alluding to a study. Harvard Forest. Thank you. Yeah, right. The conclusion was that you could build out on brownfield sites, on roofs, right, and other things, and not deforest, right? So to be solar panels. So I just think that to me the lesson is that unless you're going to go sort of authoritarian and just stifle any backlash, right? That in a democracy, the best you can do is try to anticipate those issues and to avoid that backlash. So as unsatisfying as that might be, I think that's the big takeaway for me. And again, I'm looking at the time, but I could say more. I could probe that a little more afterwards. How well did they do? In technocratic terms, I think they did quite well, frankly. I think they did. Granted, Marcondes Verhees, the engineer I mentioned, who wanted to spare these falls with his upstream dam, would not agree, right? I mean, they chose his competitor's dam, essentially. But I mean, these are not, as I mentioned earlier, these are not sort of boondoggles. These are, well-designed, well-built dams. Itaipu was the biggest power plant in the world when it was built. It's up there, second or third now. I think Three Gorges. I mean, there's other ones, but it is in its lifetime cumulatively, because Three Gorges is seasonal. Itaipu's not as much, right? It's produced the most low carbon energy, I believe, from any other power plant in the world. So I think in technocratic terms, they were listening to engineering class. This was the engineers and the military planners worked very closely together. And does that get it? Great. Okay. Europe, yeah. I mean, it's I absolutely it's on there. I should look at the map. I mean, I think some of the Alps, the countries in the Alps, were there. I'm sad that Spain somehow fell off the map. But in any case, I mean, there's
you present the book in Europe, somewhere in Europe, Spain, just take it into account.
Yeah, no, it's important.
It might be because it was percentage, right. and Spain has had such phenomenal build out of renewable sort of resources.
Solar and stuff too.
I mean, historically, you have maybe this is the country with most hydropower, but that's why it struck me to see it on the map.
No, it's great. I mean, there's a great book about dams built during the Franco dictatorship there in Spain, and so it's covered in the literature. It's great, and I think Europe. There's also a new book on hydropower in the Alps as well, called Europe's Battery, I believe, Mark Landry. In any case, it's a really important case study. So I think. I hope to see, and I hope the Brazilian case would be alongside those, in terms of the global history of hydropower and low carbon energy. Great, thanks everyone, I appreciate it.